So, hello, Patrycja. Patrycja is one of the people that made this event possible. And today she's going to tell us about the vampire narrative as a domain in 21st century philosophies. So, let's get started.
Okay, hello everybody. I will tell you today about vampire narrative. I would like to first tell you if you have any questions, just put them under the stream. They can be either in English, either in Polish. I will answer in both languages, no problem. So let's go to my presentation, to my subject. I guess I don't have to introduce the figure of vampire to you, because it has been examined and researched for a long time from, as I enumerated here, social, anthropological, psychological, philosophical points of view, and many others. Those are just few. Mostly, it was seen as the representant, the embodiment of other in metaphysical sense, as a representation of death, in psychological sense as a representation of unconsciousness, and in social sense as a racial, class, sexual, gender other. But also, and that will interest us most, according to the subject of this event, in philosophical or rather in political philosophy sense. Here I briefly enumerated most important philosophical interpretation of the vampire. This is, for example, the statement of David McNally in his book Monsters of the Market, when he tells that vampires are figures of capitalism or capitalists. However, in this book, he rather considers vampire as a metaphorical figure independently from vampire stories. I mean, he just tells that vampire can be a kind of metaphor as Marx used it. Again, we have Sławoj Žižek interpretation of Lacan. He tells that vampires are the thing with big T, who represent absolute transgression, which means they emancipated themselves from the realm of symbolic in which we, the real people, are all living. This is seen in the absence of the reflection. Vampires don't have reflection, people have, so we are imprisoned in this world of symbolic, they are not. However, as we can see, this is true only for some kind of vampires, as not all vampires actually don't have reflection. Then Susan Chaplin, interpretation of René Girard conception of scapegoat. René Girard told that scapegoat is a necessary mechanism of controlling social violence. Briefly, every society needs a scapegoat to purify itself from the amount of violence which is necessarily gathered within any social group. So nowadays crisis, according to Chaplin, is due to the issues with mechanism of scapegoat and is reflected in good guy vampire figure. Simplifying it, it means that if we have a good vampire figure, it means that there is no scapegoat mechanism working. And if it's not working, it just reflects that we have a problem because we don't have a catalyst for our violence. Also, this good guy vampire figure shows commodification of contemporary culture, consumptionist, and such things. Then we have something which I told in general as social theories of vampires as others. We can resume it in a few words that bad vampires representations, they show different conceptions of unacceptance of other, because we have a figure of bad other, dangerous other, who has to be thought and conquered. And we have for that a conception of social exclusiveness and monocultural society. If we have a good vampire, then we have a good other. So the narrative shows acceptance of others, inclusiveness, multicultural society. And lastly, which is very important, we have the theory of abjection of Julia Kristeva. And objection is, according to her, a domain of subjectivity where gather all that is socially unacceptable. Impureness, wickedness, monstrosity. It is just a symbol, a figure, a domain where we put everything we fear, everything which arouses disgust, but as well fascinates us. Okay, but there it goes the problem, because if we concentrate on vampire figure only, as all these philosophers concentrate, which I enumerated, concentrated, it necessarily leads to simplification. As I told, when we have bad vampire, it's conservative narration, and when you have a good vampire, it's emancipative narrative. Then how do we explain, for example, Twilight? Twilight saga is phenomenally conservative. Even if Chaplin considers it little consumptionist, and for her consumptionism is not non-conservative, we have to admit that in every other aspect, especially about gender relations, this narrative is highly conservative. So I claim that only analysis of whole vampire narrative as a structure can reveal true meaning of vampire stories. An intended one, which means the meaning that author wanted to give, unconscious one, which means the meaning that author didn't know he was giving, his social attitudes which were transparent for him, but we can trace them down in the narrative, and even involuntary meaning, the meaning which author didn't want to give but nonetheless gave. But this, I already explained, means, for example, that Stoker, the Bram Stoker, author of Dracula, of the most famous work on vampires, I don't think you would like to see his work as being extremely machist. He would rather think it as being very heroic. But the fact is that this work is involuntarily machist and masculinist, which I will explain later. This structure is, as you can see, we have vampire figure, victim or lover of vampire or of slayer figure, and the slayer hunter figure. Victim or lover is always the stake of conflict between these two opponents. And vampire can be, and in traditional narration, he is the object. The term I already explained talking about Julia Kristeva. And Slayer is a solar hero, the crew of light. But in more modern, new vampire narration, the roles are turned. So vampire becomes a solar hero and Slayer hunter can become the object. I will briefly tell about these three main figures. First, we go with vampire, of course. And maybe I should tell this right at the beginning. I will be telling only about fictional vampire. Here we have a short table of comparison between folkloric and fictional vampire made by Paul Barber. And we have to tell they are quite different. Folkloric vampire was a figure invented in Slavian folklore from Medium Ages, and fictional vampire was a figure who was introduced into Western culture in 19th century. Here we go with three types of vampire figure nowadays. It's of course a bad vampire, and few examples. An ambivalent vampire, about which we cannot really tell if it is seen as good or a bad figure, and a good vampire figure, of course. I will proceed chronologically. First, the evil vampire was invented, and here you have the most famous 19th century realizations. It's Vampire of John William Polidori, one of the first vampire stories. It's La Mort Amoureuse of Théophile Gautier, a French novel. And Varney the Vampire of James Malcolm Rymer. It was a story was published in newspapers called Penny Dreadful at the time. We have the Carmilla of Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, and of course we have Dracula of Bram Stoker. And this tradition was continued in 20th century. Here we have one of the first vampires movie, Nosferatu of Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau. And then we have famous realization of Hammer Studio movies, plenty of movies about Dracula with famous Christopher Lee in this role. And summarizing it, vampire in this narration is a threat to our culture and civilization. Vampire is other, as I told, can be other in racial, national, sexual, biological, class sense. Its existence is transgressive. He's dead, yet not undead, and he's objective. So we can tell he's a rebellion against social, but even further against natural and divine law. And he was a herald of anarchy, and his emergence in the society was a sign of fracture within it. There are also gender issues in it, because vampiress, yes, there is such a word, is even more objective than male vampire. Firstly, because woman was always a kind of other. Femininity was always seen as a kind of otherness itself. And moreover, vampiress is a kind of rebel female who revolted against the role of mother, wife, or virgin, roles prescribed to women at that time, who wasn't passive enough. In the 60s and 70s, however, we started the evolution of vampire figure, and the good guy vampire emerged. Vampire could be an artist, a policeman or a detective, so a guardian of social peace, and above all, a true lover. We have also to notice that a vampire becomes narrator or main hero of the story, and that the narrative adapts vampire's point of view. The figure of a hunter slayer, he emerged and was primarily male, cisgender, heterosexual, white, middle, upper class Western. So we can see he was an embodiment of social norms and values, who are then considered as who emerged at the time of colonialism, patriarchat, and all this stuff which you already know about 19th century. He was a defender or restitutor of the order, and he was a vampire contratype. His weapons were plants, stakes, firelight, religious symbol, decapitation. Mostly all of them were phallic, in the sense of white Western sexually normative masculinity triumphing over vampire or vampiress. Most common is this stake, which is a figure of phallus. On this picture, we can see it, I guess, quite clearly. Decapitation, which is a symbolic castration, and light fire, who is also a male element. Of course, a figure of a slayer evolved with a figure of vampire, and we can have, in this new kind of narrative, a bad vampire slayer opposing a good vampire. This bad one is always fanatic, fighting good vampires. But even in these traditional kind of stories where we have bad vampire and good slayer, there was also a kind of evolution, because nowadays vampires can be female, can be people of color, can be sexually non-normative, and can come from lower social classes. The third element is a vampire victim, and she was usually female, virgin, innocent, supposedly passive, subdued, gentle, guarded by her solar heroes, guided and controlled by men. She was supposed, as a good female, to follow the path of virgin daughter, then become wife and mother. Although she wouldn't be able to become the victim of vampire if she wasn't somehow susceptible to vampire seduction. So she could become the stake of conflict between hunter and vampire. And for thus, she represented control over society. On the other hand, she was that domain, the area of conflict in which hunter and vampire were fighting for the control over the society. Why victim was usually female? Female was always a kind of other, as I already told, and that's why she was susceptible to this vampire seduction, because she had a lot of common with vampire. Here we have a table where we show that femininity was associated with carnality and the matter, in Aristotle's sense, and masculinity with spirituality and form. Of course, these feminine things were also associated with vampire things. And vampire was also a kind of feminine figure, even if he was male, because he was kind of bisexual, in the sense that he mixed feminine and masculine. He had this penetrative organ as a pharynx, but he also had absorptive organ as a mouth. Vampire was a symbol of transgression of social norms, repressing female. In other words, when he was seducing her, he was also emancipating her own sexual desire that she should not have according to 19th century norms. For that, vampire was fought by the men heroes. A female was to be protected from vampire's influence, and if protection failed and she was turned into vampires, then she had to be killed. Because such a changed woman, she could not be restored to the society. She had to be killed with symbolic phallus of her man and go back to the passive role. And here we have my short diagram when we show that this Western culture, it was represented by men, solar hero, wired, heterosexual Western, with will of domination, strength, courage, and honor. There we have women who had to be put under his control because her biological conditions were a kind of a threat to the society. And here we have a contratype, vampire, but in real life, those were, for example, all the people of the East. And he wanted to seduce women and had to be blocked by men who defended the woman against the other. Of course, they were defending her in a literal sense, defending from the death, but even most important was to defend her from demoralization. Fight over the vampire was actually a fight for the domination over the woman. And we can also tell that this male vampire, even when he was a transgressive figure, was still only partially transgressive, because he gave female victims sexual emancipation, but not social one. He was always also a masculine heterosexual figure. Plenty of researchers were even telling that vampire incorporates basic fantasy about the rape on the defenseless, passive female body. From this point of view, vampiress was a figure of female empowerment, and for that, she was even more dangerous. She represented lesbian values, or again, the reversal of gender's relation if she was attacking male victims. Here we have a table comparing why female vampire was in fact more dangerous than male one. We have also to mention here that at that time, there was a theory telling that females are naturally masochist. This is in their nature to be subdued, so that and male are naturally sadist, so that extremal sadism is still in males is still a lesser deviation than masochism, and in females sadism is the biggest deviation we can have at all. And here we have the comparison of a good woman and bad rebel woman, and impure femininity and idealized femininity. And passing to this new vampire narrative, what happens in 21st century? In 21st century, we have a good vampire who takes place of the hunter, who is now a solar hero. This can represent many things, from minorities' emancipation to relativization of values. And our diagram starts to look like that. We have a vampire who represents Western culture. We have a woman, and we have a contratype. As we can see, to be honest, not a lot changes. We just have a good vampire against an evil vampire. and woman is still protected and subdued. Even we can tell it's now more dangerous, because in the old schema, still this woman had an issue, a gate to escape the social oppression, even if she was blamed for that and finally killed. But if vampire becomes everything, solar hero and the escaping gate at the same time, she has no place of escaping. And that's what happens, for example, in Twilight, when she chooses this transgressive vampire, and still she ends up in highly patriarchal relationship. So we can tell that really emancipating this discourse is relatively rare. It could look like that we have a vampire, good one, and as a contratype, a fanatic hunter, but still woman has a passive role in this. Okay. And when there is a vampiress, she's usually also, even when there is a vampire, she's usually also in the victim position. Those narrative can be seen as the exception. I hoped I proved that only the analysis of a whole narrative structure reveals ideologies which are embedded in the narrative. And now I can briefly, in last 5 minutes, go back to philosophy, pure one. As we could see, every ideology can be embodied in vampire narrative. But what in general vampire narrative symbolized? We have this triad, solar hero, society, and object, which we can easily... Poza czym?
Słucham?
Jesteśmy poza czymś?
Kontynuuj.
Okay. Which we can easily compare to the triad invented by Giorgio Agamben in his political philosophy theory of sovereign society and homo sapiens.
Jakubie, cinasz nam się z prelekcji.
Okay, okay, I'm continuing. And the conception of sovereign power was a conception of someone who creates the law and for this power who created the law, created the society, but also for that it had to remain outside this law, guards law, but is not submitted to it, which is already dangerous if we take in account the conception of democracy, for example. But actually it is the basic rule of democracy. This is a great paradox. And this sovereign power has a power over the whole society, and thanks to the conception of bare life. Every one of us has something like bare life and surplus, like our hobbies, characteristics, and so on. But mostly what is protected and what is also controlled is a bare life. And then it goes the figure of homo sacer, who is the embodiment of bare life only, because it is figure, a person who is outlawed, who is rejected from the society and excluded, and the only thing which remains for him is the bare life. For that, Agamben proves that the conception of bare life doesn't really protect at all any life, because actually on the figure of homo sacer, we can do everything. We can submit it to every medical inspection, every movement from place to place. This is a figure of refugee, for example, of the figure of these peoples, this body who are objects to medical experiments. And this is also the figure of vampire. So for that, we can tell that the vampire narrative is a reflection of the conception of sovereign power and bare life. And if you trust Agamben, that this conception is in fact the reflection and the fundament of modern society, then we can tell that vampire narrative is the reflection of broader structure of modernity. And I'd like to thank you for my presentation, and and apologize for these little disturbances, technical ones. And I'm waiting for questions.
Okay, yeah, sorry for the technicalities as well. So my question is, do you have any more information about how this medieval portrayal of a vampire became this modern standard?
Yes, this was a very interesting story because vampire figure as we know it in the fiction actually started and emerged from the clash of culture. It was when this Austrian monarchy came to these Slavian possessions in southern and eastern Europe, mostly on Balkany, the Balkanian Peninsula, and then the power, the clerks of the empire met the customs of vampires, of specific burials, of the panic with vampire epidemic in these villages. And then the Empress, Maria Theresa, sent her special agents, we can tell, also doctors, to really investigate the thing and see whether it's true or not. And at that time, the opinions in Western Europe started to be really mixed. Some of philosophers were really discussing first if such a phenomenon as vampires can really exist. It involved Diderot, Voltaire, and so on. And when they finally stated that no, they cannot exist, even if in such backwarded countries as these countries in Eastern Europe, it's not really possible, then they started to investigate why these poor people still believe in these vampires. And that's why this folkloric investigation research really started. And also at that time, writers such as George Byron, for example, became interested in this subject. They thought, okay, putting this all philosophical thing and this all naturalist thing aside, it's a very interesting subject. We can take a little of it. And he first incorporated it into his Gyaur, very famous work. There's a passage about vampire. And that's how gradually it came popular. Even before Byron, it obviously came popular in German poems because Austrians were first to examine the subject. So that's how, through politics, it came to art and then to popular culture.
Oh, that was really an interesting story. You were right. So maybe another question. How is it that Agamben writes about vampires? Is it part of a bigger context?
He does not really write about vampires. He writes about werewolves. He writes about the fact that in medium ages we can tell that Homo lupus, werewolf figure, was a perfect embodiment of the other. And examining and comparing this history into vampire narrative, we can tell that vampire narrative reflects his stories even more than werewolf one. Moreover, that to be honest, werewolf figure and vampire figure, especially in folklore, which I was talking before, were kind of associated and even mixed. We have, for example, the figure of Vricolac in Greek folklore, who was rather a mixture of werewolf and vampire figure. So it's only our fictional word of 21st century that so precisely divides these two figures. They were mixed in few folklores, and they meant quite the same one. So if Agamben makes a close approach between werewolf and his figure of Homo sacer, I claim that we can also make this reproach between vampire and werewolf figure, maybe even more. A little of such an approach was tried to be made by Nick Groom in his last book, but he just mentioned it. I think that this conception needs to be developed because it's worth it.
This is a long shot, but there's also this figure of a vampire or vampire, half human, half vampire. Have you come across it being analyzed in such a sexual context as you did with the vampire? Is it a separate figure, or do people not write about it at all?
They do actually. They because this vampire figure, it was also in Romanian folklore. It's taken from folklore. They were believing that actually a vampire can rise from the grave and come to his wife, and she won't recognize it. I don't know how. She wouldn't know that her husband was dead. I don't know. And actually make a son to her. And this son was meant to be a vampire. And this vampire was meant to become a vampire slayer. He was especially meant to it because he had all the powers needed. So a vampire is essentially a vampire slayer figure. And yes, it's also interesting that to this folkloric conception, authors of vampire narratives only took this folkloric conception of vampire in 21st century. Like in 19th century, it was completely forgotten because this vampire slayer had to be a completely pure figure, as I thought. Completely pure, clean figure, only male, cisgender, heterosexual, and so on. He cannot be some hybrid or something like that. But with the evolution of the narrative, evolution of all the figures, gradually also the conception that maybe this slayer doesn't have to be that pure. Maybe we can go to the folklore and take this vampire figure as a slayer who will be a hybrid, a mixture, a guy with problems, not so pure blood one, and maybe we can take it. Then only this idea emerged, and we went back to folklore and took this figure, which can be inscribed in this new vampire slayer figure, because vampires are vampire slayers in these narratives.
Okay, thanks. I think that will be all. I just read the comments. Great presentation. So that's also my opinion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.